People said the millionaire couldn't be shaken, no fear, no shame, no humanity left in him. But that morning, inside a crowded downtown restaurant, he made a promise so cold it froze the air around him. He slammed a briefcase on the table, its metallic echo slicing through every conversation, and laughed loud enough for strangers to stare. He said he would give $1 million to anyone who could heal the pain he claimed no one on earth could touch. And then he pointed at the black waitress standing nearby, as if she were invisible, as if her worth began and ended with the apron she wore. His challenge wasn't a request. It was a joke. A performance. A show meant to humiliate, filmed on his own hidden camera to make the world laugh with him. But she didn't flinch. Not when he mocked her. Not when the crowd whispered. Not when her manager pretended not to notice. She simply stepped closer, steady, silent, as if she saw something no one else did. A man drowning behind a smile. A soul begging for rescue. And in that single moment, the impossible happened. What did she see, what did she know, that made the millionaire's laughter die in his throat? Before we dive deeper, where in the world are you watching this from? Before that moment in the restaurant, before the briefcase, before the mockery, Amara lived a life built on quiet strength. She wasn't famous, powerful, or wealthy. She didn't own a business or have a following cheering her on. She was a waitress who worked long shifts, kept her head down, and carried the weight of other people's moods with practiced calm. Most mornings began the same way. She walked to the bus stop before sunrise, the sky still dark enough to blur the city into silhouettes. She carried a small journal in her bag, filled with reminders to breathe through the day, to stay steady no matter who she served. She lived with her grandmother in a small apartment 2 floors above a bakery, where the smell of warm bread drifted through the vents before dawn. It was not an easy life, but it was hers, simple, predictable, steady. At the restaurant, people knew her as the one who held everything together. The one who remembered allergies, anniversaries, and how customers liked their coffee. She didn't have the luxury of choosing who she served, including the people who thought service workers owed them more than respect. She had learned long ago how quickly a smile could turn cruel, how easily a joke could become a weapon. Still, she carried herself with quiet dignity. What most people didn't know, and what she never talked about, was the heaviness she kept tucked beneath that calm. The exhaustion of navigating a world that judged her before she spoke. The ache of being dismissed, underestimated, or talked over simply because of her skin. Every shift felt like walking a tightrope, balancing patience with pain. The millionaire, Elias Ward, was the type of customer she had spent years preparing herself for. Loud. Entitled. Always performing for an audience. His visits brought a storm with him, the kind that left staff shaken long after he left. But on the morning he walked in with that briefcase, something about him felt different. The arrogance was still there, the smirk still sharp, but beneath it, something trembled. Something raw. Amara noticed it the moment she stepped toward his table. A tension in his shoulders. A flicker in his eyes. A man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. She didn't know what it meant yet. She didn't know that his challenge would put her at the center of a crowd hungry for spectacle. She didn't know that his pain was deeper than money could bury, and darker than anyone imagined. She only knew one thing. Something was coming. And whatever it was already moving toward her. The moment Elias Ward slammed that briefcase onto the table, the restaurant shifted. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Silverware froze halfway to mouths. People turned, not out of concern, but curiosity, the kind that follows the scent of drama. Amara felt the weight of 100 eyes pressing against her back as she approached his table. She had served difficult customers before, but this felt different. This felt orchestrated. Elias leaned back like a man on stage, letting his laughter roll through the room. It wasn't joy. It was cruelty wearing a grin. He lifted the briefcase and cracked it open just enough for the closest tables to gasp at the neatly stacked bills inside. $1 million. He wanted witnesses. He wanted attention. And he expected her to shrink under it. But she didn't. Instead, she kept steady breaths as he told the room that he was unbeatable, unbreakable, untouchable, that no one could cure the pain that lived in him. People chuckled along, eager to stay on his good side. Some whispered things they thought she couldn't hear, comments about the help, about knowing her place, and about how money like that wasn't meant for people like her. Each word cut a little deeper, but she didn't let it show. The manager watched from a distance, frozen between protecting his employee and protecting his own job. He chose silence. He chose the millionaire. He chose the easy way out. That left Amara alone. Elias stared at her, waiting for her to react. He wanted embarrassment. He wanted fear. He wanted the kind of silence that confirmed every bias he carried. But what he found instead was a calm he couldn't rattle. It irritated him. His smirk tightened, and he pushed further, raising his voice so the entire restaurant could hear him belittle her. And the comments started. Someone at a nearby table whispered something about her being desperate for money. Another murmured that she should lighten up, that it was just a joke. A third asked why she wasn't grateful to even be acknowledged. Those words hurt worse than Elias's showmanship. They were quiet, casual, and spoken with entitlement instead of malice, words people thought were harmless because they'd never been on the receiving end of them. Microaggressions layered over her like invisible bruises. Still, she didn't retreat. Elias's act grew more chaotic. His hands shook as he gestured wildly, as if he were losing control of the performance he started. The more she held her composure, the more it exposed something he had tried to bury. The pain behind his eyes flickered brighter, more desperate. The crowd saw none of it, only the arrogance, the challenge, and the spectacle. But Amara saw the hollowness. She saw the man behind the mask. And that terrified him. He tried to regain the upper hand by making the challenge harsher, suggesting she wouldn't dare help someone like him. He layered his words with venom, inviting the crowd to laugh with him. Some did. Others recorded on their phones. The room buzzed with excitement, but beneath it, a cold undercurrent grew, an unspoken tension that made the walls feel smaller. For a moment, it seemed like the pressure would push Amara into retreat. The humiliation was sharp. The stares were suffocating. And the smell of rich food suddenly mixed with something acidic in her throat. But she stood her ground, steady as a stone in a storm. Then came the moment no one expected. Elias's laughter cracked. It didn't fade, it broke. A single breath slipped out of him with the weight of someone who had been suffocating for years. His shoulders slumped. His eyes glistened, not with arrogance, but with exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that can no longer hide behind money, or status, or cruelty. His mask fell. But before Amara or anyone else could speak, a voice from across the restaurant cut through the moment. "Leave her alone. You've had your fun." The room froze. Elias straightened sharply, the pain replaced by fury. The stranger who spoke stepped forward, not aggressive but firm, refusing to let the spectacle continue. A few customers nodded in agreement, but others bristled, annoyed that the entertainment was being interrupted. And the tension in the room spiraled tighter, sharper, and more dangerous. Amara felt it shift, the line between spectacle and confrontation thinning. Elias closed the briefcase slowly, his expression unreadable now. No laughter, no arrogance, just something dark settling behind his eyes. Then he stood. He moved toward Amara with a cold, quiet intensity that made every muscle in her body tighten. Whatever happened next would not be a joke. Elias stepped closer, and every sound in the restaurant fell into a suffocating silence. No clinking forks. No whispering voices. Only the heavy rhythm of his footsteps crossing the polished floor. Amara stood rooted in place, her pulse pounding in her ears. For a moment, she wasn't sure if he was going to yell, mock her again, or do something far worse. The air thickened with tension so sharp it felt like it could cut skin. When he stopped in front of her, his breath trembled, just once, barely noticeable. But she noticed. She noticed everything. His eyes, once filled with performative cruelty, now held something else entirely: panic. A silent, desperate panic that made his shoulders curl inward as if his own body was caving under a pressure no one else could see. Then he whispered, not with his voice, but with his expression, the truth. He was breaking. Right there, in front of everyone. His hands shook violently as he tried to grip the edge of a table, knocking over glasses, sending water splashing across the floor. The crowd gasped. Phones rose higher, recording every second. His mask had finally shattered, and the world was watching him fall apart. Elias staggered back, pressing a hand to his chest as if his world had collapsed in on itself. People assumed it was a performance. A stunt. Another dramatic addition to his ridiculous challenge. But Amara saw the truth carved across his face, the raw kind of pain no amount of money could disguise. A grief so deep it seemed to pull the air out of the room. If this story has you hooked, hit subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. She stepped forward. Not out of fear. Not out of pity. But because something inside her recognized the desperation he'd been choking on. As she reached him, several customers shouted for her to stay away. Someone muttered that she was asking for trouble. Another hissed that this wasn't her business. The subtle racism that had stalked her every day now rose louder and uglier, aimed at keeping her in a place the world thought she belonged. But she ignored them all. She placed a steady hand near his arm, not touching him, but close enough for him to feel the presence of someone who wasn't there to judge, laugh, or record. And just like that, something inside him cracked open. His knees buckled. She caught his fall, not physically, but emotionally, by being the only person willing to see him, not the persona he projected. The room watched in disbelief as Elias collapsed into a storm of trembling breaths, unable to contain the agony he had spent years burying beneath power and performance. And for the first time, the truth spilt out, not in words, but in the way he clung to the edge of breath, the way he stared at her as if she were the first solid ground he'd seen in years. His grief was suffocating him. His guilt was swallowing him whole. And the weight of the world he had built, the empire, the arrogance, the armor, was crushing him from the inside. Amara didn't need to heal him with magic. She didn't need $1 million. All she offered was presence. Understanding. Humanity, something he had forgotten how to receive. The crowd slowly lowered their phones. The whispers died out. The spectacle dissolved into something else entirely. Something real. Elias, the man who believed he couldn't be touched, was finally feeling everything he had tried to outrun. And as the room watched him unravel in the one place he thought he controlled, one question rose in Amara's mind, a question that would shape everything that happened next. How do you save someone who has spent their whole life destroying themselves? The restaurant emptied slowly, like people were tiptoeing out of a place that had suddenly become sacred. What had begun as a spectacle, a joke at Amara's expense, had transformed into something none of them understood. And for the first time in years, Elias Ward wasn't performing. He sat at the corner table, his hands trembling, his breath uneven, his eyes fixed on nothing. The briefcase sat beside him, forgotten. Amara didn't ask what had broken him. She didn't pry, didn't judge, didn't try to fill the silence. She simply stood nearby, offering space for him to breathe again. And slowly, something shifted. His breathing steadied. His shoulders lowered. His gaze lifted, meeting hers with a kind of fragile honesty that felt like a confession. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to explain the cruelty he'd used like armor. But in the faint tremor of his expression, she saw the truth, years of grief, loneliness, pressure, and pain buried beneath power and privilege. Pain so deep it rotted everything it touched. When the manager finally approached, relieved the chaos was fading, Amara stepped forward before he could speak. She didn't protect Elias. She didn't justify what happened. She simply asked for her shift to end early. And the manager, shaken by what he'd witnessed, quietly agreed. As she stepped out into the evening air, the world felt heavier. Not because of Elias, but because of what the moment represented. How quickly a room full of strangers had sided with power before understanding the truth. How easily her humanity was dismissed until it became impossible to ignore. How normal it had become to watch harm unfold without stepping in. Racism didn't always scream. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it laughed. Sometimes it hid behind jokes, behind expectations, behind the quiet assumption that people like her should carry the weight of other people's comfort. But that day, something unexpected had happened. Her strength, steady, calm, unwavering, had forced a crack in a world built on hierarchy. She had reminded a man who had everything that he was still human. And she had reminded everyone watching that dignity isn't earned through money, status, or power. It is inherent, unshakable, shared. The next morning, the restaurant was buzzing with rumors. Some exaggerated, some minimized, some twisted beyond recognition. But a small number of people, the ones who felt the weight of the moment, approached her with quiet apologies. Not for what they said, but for what they didn't. For the silence they hid in while she was left standing alone. Elias didn't return. But 2 days later, the restaurant received a donation in her name, anonymous but unmistakable. $1 million wasn't attached this time. There was no spectacle. No audience. Only a short note asking for forgiveness he knew he hadn't earned, and a promise to start healing the right way. Amara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her part was done. The world outside the restaurant hadn't changed overnight. But inside her, something had shifted, a deeper understanding of her own power, her own presence, and the quiet courage she carried every day. Because sometimes the strongest act of resistance isn't shouting. Sometimes it's standing still when the world wants you to disappear. If stories like this matter, don't forget to share.